Testing has become a larger part of school life since the last decades of the 20th century. There are many more systems-mandated tests, students spend more time taking tests, and teachers spend more class time preparing their students for tests. Nearly always, these are norm-referenced summative assessments. As a consequence, assessment has become a site of very fierce debate. Some people advocate strongly for more assessment because they create an outcomes-focused culture of accountability for teachers and schools. Standards clarify what should be learnt, so the tests related to standards should tell us what learners, teachers, school administrators, parents, and the wider community need to know. That is, what has actually been learnt. Others, however, have argued against the culture of tests and testing, or at the very least, the kinds of tests we have today, because they argue that these tests create new problems while doing no better than meeting old educational requirements.
So that's thinking of assessment in a temporal mode, when it happens. But there's another way to divide up assessment modes, and that is around types of measurement. And I'm going to talk about 3 types of measurement. The first is norm-referenced measurement. So what we do is we have all these students in a class or a grade, and what we're going to do is we're going to spread them all out. We're going to compare them to each other. Now, what we do classically with standardized tests is we ask everybody the same questions, and we have a consistent scoring mechanism so that we're measuring everybody by the same thing. Now, by the way, this is not necessarily a good thing because not everybody's the same. People might be good at some things and not good at others. So the assumption is that it's good to measure everybody by the same thing. There's an underlying assumption behind standardized assessment which may well not be entirely true, or we may not want to agree with. But anyhow, what we do then is we spread people across a normal distribution curve. Here's a classic normal distribution curve here in this illustration. Or it's often called the bell curve. It looks like somewhat like a bell. And in the bell curve, there are very few people who are really smart. There are quite a few people who are mediocre, and there are a few people who are the dummies, the real dummies. So what you're doing is essentially the measurement is a comparative measurement against the norm, against others, and against a single standard. The origins of this, the bell curve norm reference assessment, are in fact the very first tests that are created with modern schooling, which are IQ test, intelligence quotient. And what this was, it was a classic bell curve, a classic normal distribution curve, and these were literally the way in which IQ tests were scored. IQ tests are now well over a century, getting onto a century and a half old as a testing form. So if you were absolutely in the middle of the universe in terms of so-called intelligence, you got 100. And if you were super bright, you got 140, 145. And if you were in some way had some kind of mental disability, your IQ scores were way down the other end there. Now, in fact, IQ tests are still used. They're not used nearly as much as they were in the past, and they're mainly used these days for students with various forms of disability, and for that they're actually reasonably useful. For the rest of the population, in fact, they're pretty problematic because their assumption, which is a questionable one, is that there is such a thing as native intelligence which spreads out across a curve. To what extent can you separate the cultural conditions in which you live? To what extent can you separate the educational experiences that you've had? Have you been to good schools or not so good schools? What have your teachers been like? How can you separate that out in a test of intelligence? Because after all, IQ tests, they're meant to be language free because it's a pattern of diagrams or certain forms of logic. But in fact, if we think of from a multiliteracy's point of view, even visual logics are learnt. So the idea you can strip language out of it, you can strip, cultural experience, various games that you've played which may well make you smarter at the game. The idea that this is a native or natural intelligence is actually pretty problematic. And that's one of the reasons why In the area of standards-based assessment, we're more interested in what you can achieve on the assumption that it would be possible for anybody of your age, including you, to achieve as well on a particular standard. It's not a matter of spreading people across the curve in these ways.